Hi, my name is Kevin Hollern, and I am the founder, CEO, and Chief Information Security Officer of Holosec Information Security. After being a CISO for many years at a Fortune 300 automotive group, a large gaming and hospitality organization, and a credit union in the Midwest, I founded Holosec Information Security to help organizations large and small leverage information security as an asset, not a hindrance. At Holosec, we believe information security's role is not to say no, but help the organization say yes, putting up guardrails to help them move with greater velocity and more confidence. To do this, we must be able to communicate with the business, speak their language, and connect at their level, becoming a partner with the business units. This involves us becoming a secondary character while they tell their story of success in the organization. We are excited to announce 3 new initiatives that we're adding to Holosec Information Security. First, we are launching a series of short videos that address strategic topics within our philosophy for security. Second, we've added 2 new services to our service portfolio: security awareness as a service and risk management as a service, where Holosec will build, execute, and manage these programs on your behalf to ensure they drive value. Third, we've launched the latest version of Secameo. It has an all-new user experience, a completely redesigned UI that is twice as fast and more intuitive and efficient. We think you'll love it. Today, we're going to show off some of the new features and the new look of Secameo's Risk Management Platform. So let's head over and take a look. As we log in, we see our risk dashboard to start, where we can track metrics and see how risks, risk assessments, and even our treatment plans are holding up so far. As we go in, we're going to start with the service provider section. This is any of the third parties that we leverage. We can put into this application and track them. As you can see here, we've got a series of service providers in our demo tenant, and we track these and grade them on a series of criteria. We can see when our last risk assessment was performed and when our next one might be due based on their tier. If we dive into some of these, we can take a look at a series of criteria for our particular service provider, Grolier Recovery Services. You can see that we track across a variety of data points to come up with a triage score, how much they would impact the organization, then a classification score based on how much they would impact us from a cost and whether they're customer facing and operational impact. So we've got our impact assessment. We can vary these dollar amounts to our own needs. And we track across with a triage a series of data points, things like, do they have an information security program? Have they had a recent breach? Do they leverage critical fourth parties? Do they have appropriate certifications or insurance? Do they have data that goes overseas or does it stay domestic? And these areas end up giving us an overall triage score to help us determine how much of a risk this particular service provider might be. And we can scroll through this pretty easily, pretty quickly. We can see any particular risk assessments, which we have none for this particular vendor, and we can add a series of notes on this vendor, such as this one here. Very solid vendor. As we look into our service providers, another one here, we have a very high risk score as it hits very specific data points. It's critical cost. It would be financially impacting. Maybe they've had a recent breach in the last 18 months. This highlights this vendor as a much more risky vendor for us. And it also has a critical score saying it'd be very impactful to the organization, which then drives our overall risk necessity for how often we reevaluate the service provider. So we can see that we have a particular risk assessment, 07001. Let's go over and take a look at that assessment. So we go into our risk assessments and we find our risk assessment here, 07001. And we can launch into this and we track a series of data points on our risk assessment. We start with what is the assessment, who owns it in our organization, who's performing the risk analysis, when is it open, when is it expected by. We've got assessment statuses. Is it actively being worked on? Are we waiting for internal or external stakeholders? Are we behind? Is it closed or has it not been started yet? And then we can have a variety of phases in our risk assessment process. So preparation is just getting started. Initiation is where we kick off. Discovery is when we're learning about the particular service provider this software as a service, the information system, whatever it is we're actually assessing. It doesn't have to be a service provider. This is where we are doing information discovery. If we were looking to gather information from a service provider, it would happen in this phase. Then we have our analysis when we're actually doing the analysis of the risks and of the service provider, of the situation. Then we go into reporting, where we're authoring our report. Then we've got delivery, and then we've got our closure. And then we also have a status of closed, rejected, which we'll get to later when we talk about approvals. We can target any regulatory impacts. If we have any frameworks, we can tie it to a third party. We can also link it to a particular document repository if you're storing documents on SharePoint, OneDrive, or some other document repository. And we have a justification. Why are we actually doing this assessment? Over here, we can talk about approval status, which we'll get to when we talk about enterprise risk committees. And then we've got our stakeholders listed here, where we can see we have our business owner as well as other stakeholders that are currently impacted. As we're analyzing this, we can put in an executive summary and a summation for the report. We can also tie it into our threat model, where we tie it into specific threat actors that may be in ones to target this particular instance, and we can take a look at those. We can also take those threat actors and export them directly to Attack Navigator to take a look and see what their TTPs are, and actually evaluate our controls against those. And then we provide a threat model summation. We give some commentary on that for the final report. Moving further in our risk assessment, we can come up with a series of loss scenarios. We're big believers here at Holosec that loss scenarios are really what drives risk assessment. These are the business statements, and we have them tied to various authors. These are stakeholders in this risk assessment that would help us author these. They would come up with what are the bad things that might happen, and we would help facilitate those loss scenario statements. Those loss scenario statements are then used to actually drive what the risks might be. And we add a series of risks. We can tie these directly from loss scenarios. We can create them as a part of this assessment, tie them to specific owners, give them specific statuses, tie it into an area. Is it an information risk? Is it a human risk? Is it a regulatory risk? What are the categories for this risk? Do they touch into supply chain? Is it for non-repudiation, etc.? And then how would we recommend a treatment plan for this? We can accept the risk. We can wrap the risk in controls, fix the risk, transfer in some way with insurance or possibly to a provider, or we can avoid and walk away. We come up with our risks that are authored from the loss scenario risk statements, and then we can actually go into, we'll skip risk analysis layers, come back in just a moment. We can go into corrective action plans, and these are the treatment plans that we would author, that we would tie to specific risks and say, this is how we will actually treat this risk. So we would come up with a series of recommendations here, how we're going to test it, and also does this require some kind of budget? If it requires budget, then what are the budget details? Is there capital or operational expenditures involved with this? What is the status of the particular corrective action plan? And then what is the type of this corrective action plan? Is it a human or cultural control process, or is it a specific technology? Now, a corrective action plan may address multiple risks, and a risk may have multiple corrective action plans. For instance, you may institute a technology control, but you also may have a training element for it as well. Within our risk assessment, we can also have this idea of risk analysis layers. And we can have a quantitative or qualitative risk analysis layer, and we can create these in a way that says this is a precondition or inherent risk, this is before any controls, or we can toggle this and make it a post-treatment. So this is pre-inherent risk and residual risk after controls, and we can make this a qualitative assessment, or we can make it a quantitative assessment. Qualitative assessment would be high, medium, low, and we'll look at that in just a moment. This is a quantitative assessment. We can dive into this layer and we can see how we perform a quantitative analysis. We can tie this to specific risks as part of the assessment, or if none are selected, it will just apply to all risks in the assessment, in the risk assessment. When we look at the percentile, this is our percentile that we key in on for the annualized loss expectancy and single loss expectancy for our distribution graph. So in this model, we're importing our threat capability, actually comes in populated from our threat model that we selected earlier. We can identify what is our controls resistance strength, which will then calculate or derive our vulnerability. We can say how often we're going to have a threat event every year, and all this calculates up to this loss event frequency numbers. On this side, we can get these loss numbers, whether it's primary loss or secondary loss, and calculate how much an instance of loss would cost us in this scenario. This is then run through a statistical analysis simulation engine, which then comes up with a distribution we'd see down at the bottom here. And then we can see that we can key in on these various percentiles as part of our analysis to in line with our risk appetite to determine what our loss expectancy is. In this case, our annualized loss expectancy, 728,000, and a single loss expectancy, 72,000. So this is a quantitative analysis, and when we choose our percentile, when we do risk management, our percentile shifts based on our risk appetite. With these idea of analysis layers, and we can add as many of these to the analysis as we want for this assessment. We'd like some quantitative and some qualitative. We can see that we have a precondition here, then we have a post-treatment where we've identified a series of corrective action plans, and we can see how that actually reduced the risk from our annualized loss expectancy by implementing the controls. Another mechanism that we can do is qualitative analysis, and again, you can do this, you can do both as part of the same assessment. You can target different risks by attaching it to different risk levels, or you can just do one or the other. So as we look at the analysis of this separate risk assessment, we can dive in here, and this is a qualitative risk layer, where we come in and say this is a precondition, we can tie it to risks, or it can be for all. And then what we have here is this idea of a data asset multiplier. This is proprietary to Holosec, but a way that we actually multiply the risk based on how critical the information assets are. We do that through the data classification. How important is the data to us? The data value, how valuable is it to attackers? The impact to the business, how impactful would it be to operations if this was unavailable or destroyed, altered, or disclosed? And then any regulatory impact if there is. Then we have a justification. Why did we come up with these numbers? This ultimately gives us a 1.13 data asset multiplier. And then we look across a series of risk consideration areas that Holosec has used for many years to identify areas for potential risk. So organizational risk, and we can give it a qualitative measurement for likelihood and impact. We zoom in, likelihood of medium low and an impact of medium, and then we've got a scoring justification as to why we came up with those values, and each category has a description at the top to help you guide you on what to consider for the scoring. So each one of these areas, from organizational risk, architecture and design risk, we've got systems and technology, we've got risk for business critical systems, does this interact with any key systems, supply chain risk, skill set requirements consideration, does this require BSD Unix and nobody else on our team has that skill, which may increase the risk. Physical security, threat landscape, third-party access. We've got a series of risks. This ultimately adds up to a scoring level, which then is multiplied by the data asset multiplier, and it's given a percentage score out of 100 for the overall risk score. We can add notes again at the bottom, just like before, and we can add a note. And when we add a note, we can put in information, we can mark it up with Markdown, and then we can flag this, make visible to stakeholders. So if a stakeholder logs into the system, they see different views. They can see the risk assessments that they have input, they can see corrective action plans and risks, and they can see appropriate notes that are made visible to stakeholders. Not all notes need to be visible to stakeholders. The ones that are flagged here will then be allowed to be viewed by the stakeholders. And ultimately, we end up with a layer score. In this case, 18.9 out of 100, which maps into a low risk based on our risk appetite. So with all this, we end up with risk scoring from the analysis. We end up with a series of corrective action plans that are created as treatment plans. And we can view these in our next view, which is the risk register. So we see our risk register. These are all the open risks currently within the system. Risks can be added as part of a risk assessment, or you can add a risk directly and have it not be part of a risk assessment. So in this case, this risk source maybe comes from change management or some other testing assessment that is found, and we can fill in this risk and have it show up on the risk register without actually being attached to a risk assessment. The risk scoring, when attached to a risk assessment, if it is not manually scored, it will take on the score of any analysis layers that it's tied to. So if it's tied to a qualitative analysis layer, it'll take on the scoring of that qualitative analysis layer, unless this manual risk scoring is toggled, and then we can set the likelihood and the impact of the risk itself directly. And as we view these on the risk register, these risks that are open can be addressed and viewed. As we view a risk, we can see all the information on the risk, all the notes, and any associated corrective action plans for this risk. We can even flip directly to the risk assessment itself to see if it's tied to one. Corrective action plan view is pretty much the same type of view, where we see a list of corrective action plans that we have open, see what the status are, and we can drill into these and dive into even more information to see about any of the notes, any of the test plans, any of the data related to the corrective action plan, along with approval status. Moving away from the risk management, we can go into our threat model. Currently we have two elements to our threat model. One is the threat dashboard, which just highlights the current threat actors that have been tagged in the system and allows you to view them. The other is the attacker threat model itself, which provides a little bit more detailed view. As we look across a series of threat actors, we can dive into their data sets. We can hit the little view icon and we see a bunch of information that can be populated, and then the threat score related to our organization. So we have a threat ID, any aliases that these threat actors may go by. We can tie them into a specific type of threat community, whether it's organized crime, state actor, hacktivist. If we edit this threat actor, we can see that as we dive into things like the threat capability and we shift this, it'll give a different description of what that capability is. So a very high threat capability is an adversary that has very sophisticated level of expertise and is well resourced. So we can fill in all this data about a particular threat actor as it relates to our organization, and help keep an eye on anybody that may be attacking us, attaching those to risk assessments for things like scoring, for things like pivoting into the tools, tactics, and procedures they may use and overlay our particular controls to help us prioritize. So we may select a few. Scattered Spider's been in the news a lot lately, so we can grab a couple of these, say, and then we can actually say export to attack. It will create an attack navigator layer, and it will actually launch that layer into the attack navigator tool set. If you're not familiar with attack navigator, it's just a fantastic tool that helps you kind of visualize and track threat actors. So we'll make a small change to how this is viewed here. And you can see then now that we've got a variety of colors on this, from yellows and oranges. And what happens is we've overlaid all three threat actors into one, and the colors shift based on the TTPs that they use. So you can see this account discovery has a score of 2. That means 2 of our 3 threat actors use this particular tactic when they're attacking, as you can see, used by Scattered Spider and Fin 6. So we can actually drill down in and take a look across these. Anything that is not filled in is not used, is known to be used by those threat actors, and we can actually drill into viewing the technique and say, okay, with this particular technique, are there any mitigations that MITRE brings up that we may want to take a look at? So in this case, our detections, we can actually evaluate, okay, how are we doing on this? And it'll help us as part of our risk assessment to not only quantify where we stand against the threat actors, but also potentially prioritize efforts for securing the environment a little bit more. And this can be done for any number of threat actors as you fill in the threat model as part of the attacker threat model. Now that we've identified threat actors, performed our threat assessment in context of our risk assessment, looked at the tools, tactics, and procedures, maybe designed some countermeasures or at least used them to inform our risks and corrective action plans, We've performed our risk analysis with our qualitative or quantitative layers, identified risks and treatment plans. We are ready to view the report. So as we dive into our risk assessment itself, we can look at the assessment phase. The report is available to stakeholders and business owners when the assessment phase is in the reporting, delivery, or closure state. Anything before that, and it will not be available to the business owner or stakeholders, but is available to an administrator or a risk analyst with this preview report button. Earlier, we looked at the executive summary and summation, where we've got these boxes where we can write using markup to create an executive summary and a summation. We can use a full screen editor, take a look at these if we need more room. We can actually preview the context and see how our markup is going. That will come back into a point with the report itself, and the same with the threat profiles, as we can add a threat model summation with some context and discussion around our threat model, why we added the threat actors we did, and why we might focus countermeasures on them. We go back and we look at the preview report button, and we will load our report view for this particular assessment. So no more PDFs, no more emailing, no more Word documents or writing in an editor. Everything can be enclosed directly within the risk assessment itself. Across the top, we see the different sections of our risk assessment report, from risk scoring, executive summary, all the way down through the risks, corrective action plans, and summation. Starting with the risk score, we see our inherent risk score, which is pulled from our qualitative layers. In this case, we did not use quantitative. If we did, it would appear below. If we use both, our quantitative would appear in place of this. We can see that we had an 18.9%. And then the residual risk score after the treatment plans were implemented dropped to 4.5%. We saw that when we were doing the analysis layers earlier. We see the actual author of the report, the risk analyst assigned, as well as our executive summary, and then attached to the executive summary is a risk and corrective action plan or treatment summary, just highlighting the risks that we're addressing and the mechanism in which we're treating these. We've got our overview section, which is the background section of the risk assessment itself, the business owner, stakeholders, the various dates and the statuses. We've got our business justification. This is the reason that we are performing the assessment. Why is this particular assessment needed, or why is this change of service provider a part of this? And we've got our service provider details, along with all of the tiering that we have that we set up for our particular service provider, if a service provider is a part of this risk assessment. We continue to see our threat model laid out. We can go directly to our MITRE attack to review the particular threat actors if we want to from the report, and we've got our threat model summation listed here as well. And then we get into our data classification, any reasoning behind that data classification. We list out our loss scenarios and our risk analysis layers that we perform analysis with, and including all of the details. And these are expandable to see our notes and justification directly into the risk consideration areas. If there were quantitative risk analysis, that would be here along with the graphs and tables that we saw in that layer as well. We've got our risks along with the risk data that the notes that we put in, along with our risk scoring and our corrective action plans, and expand the corrective action plans to see those recommendations, and there's a list of risks that they address. And we close out with some kind of summation, some kind of closing action at the end of our report. And you'll see over here, it's not in the approval phase. It's currently not an approval phase. If it wasn't an approval phase, this would have an approve button for stakeholders and business owners, which we can look at in a different view. So that is our risk report, everything in one place for people to review. There is an exports PDF feature that will be coming soon, where you can export this directly to a PDF to file away. The next section we want to look at is just the administrative and configuration. Go into configuration, and we can see that we can manage our users. We can add users in here. We can manage our departments and add users to and from departments. And then finally, we can manage our organizational settings. In our organizational settings, this is where we will be able to turn on two-factor authentication and enforce it for all our users. We have our quantitative percentile. So this is the percentile that maps to our risk appetite. It defaults to 80%, but you can shift that for your organization as you see fit. We've got our Enterprise Risk Committee approval quorum. This is where when we're working through an Enterprise Risk Committee approval, does one member need to do it? Majority of members or all members need to weigh in before it's approved. And then we've got a risk threshold level where elements are elevated to the Enterprise Risk Committee based on their risk level. So right now, no ERC required. We can change this to say anything medium or higher would require enterprise risk level review. And then we can write an actual risk appetite statement to say this is the kind of way we approach risk. Service provider thresholds, where we determine what is non-essential, significant, and critical cost for us. And then finally, risk appetite levels, where we can say what is our low risk, medium, and so on. And this maps into our quantification method, where if we come up with a quantifiable risk of $1 million, is that a high or is that a medium high? And it allows us to still overlay that qualitative element to it. So the last section of this administrative and analyst view is the Enterprise Risk Committee section. And we can see that the Enterprise Risk Committee is a separate menu up at the top. Analysts and admins to the system can be Enterprise Risk Committee members, or they may not be, and that is the same with analysts. So we can toggle that switch on for any user and make them a part of the Enterprise Risk Committee. So what we may see is a high-level executive set from a varying business units be a part of the Enterprise Risk Committee, and there may be representation from the security team on there, or there may not be, depending on the organization. So as we go in, you can see this has three sections: a dashboard of metrics that can be reviewed by the Enterprise Risk Committee. We've got open items, which lists anything that has a higher risk level, and any challenged risk items if a stakeholder challenges a particular item. And we can go into the approvals workflow itself, where we list anything that is pending approval by the Enterprise Risk Committee. The Enterprise Risk Committee can dive into the details and review these. With a panel, it'll show all the details and the data across the risk assessment, as well as across any of the risks themselves, or any of the corrective action plans that are listed out. And all this information is here, and it allows them to be able to approve, reject, and close, or reject and force a re-review into this. So now we can see in the organizational profile, we came and changed the ERC risk level to high or higher. So it should no longer capture the medium or medium highs, and we can update that within the app as an admin. So if we go back over to the ERC and take a look at the approvals, now we see there's significantly less there, as there's a single risk that was rated as high that would require a review by the ERC. Thank you for joining us for this demo of the brand new streamlined user interface and user experience for Secameo, the HoloSec Risk Management Platform. We're constantly adding new features, and we'd love to hear from you for what you'd like to see in the tool set next. Head over to holosec.com or email us at consulting@holosec.com to get started on your risk management journey with Secameo today.